So we'll get us started. My name is Alex Arnold. I'm the executive consultant for the Taos Institute, and we are here today for a wonderful webinar, the Pulsating Practices, Constructionism in Action. And we are here with Hilary Bradbury, who will introduce in just a moment. Just a few words about the Taos Institute. We are a virtual nonprofit organization. We promote social constructionist, appreciative, relational practices and ideas, and we do so in many, many different ways. So we have courses and workshops. We have webinars like this one. We have an online community, the Taos Institute Commons, that we invite you to join if you haven't yet. We organize conferences and workshops and have a series of books, free books that are available on our website for free to download. And that is the World Share Book Series. Also invite you to check those out. And I will pass it on to Ken Gergen, co-founder and president of the Taos Institute, in just a moment. And before we do that, I wanted to let you know that we do have a translated caption feature available. If you do want your captions on and you can turn them into your own language, you can see the icon at the bottom of your screen. So go look for captions and then you can set it up to your own language. So hopefully this is a helpful feature. So Ken, did you want to take it from here?
Thanks, Alex. Hilary, great pleasure to have you here. It really is. I think for me, personally, you're like the queen mother of action research. Now, I mean, when action research really came into visibility was actually about 25 years ago with your handbook on action research with Peter Reason. I mean, I think that was the first ever handbook. You followed it up with your own handbook, I think, roughly 15 years later. And now you are generating your own books, given Action Research Plus, which is a lovely organization, which has its own website. I think everyone ought to take a visit after they get off here, because on that website, you'll find all sorts of wonderful things going on where Hilary invites in issues of meditation and spirituality added to action research. Some of you may know Hilary from her life in the United States. She grew up or was born in Dublin, but spent most of her academic career here. Was at Case Western, which many of you have frequented, Ohio State, USC. She is now back in Dublin. I can appreciate why, given what it is like in the United States these days. And on that level, let me just say that whatever it is we're confronting right now, it's enormous, it's daunting, it's frightening. But in terms of social science and what the social sciences can do, and I think a variety of practices as well, I think action research is the key form of inquiry, which we have as a wedge into the positive future. So I really appreciate your being here, Hilary. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you.
It's my honor. Thank you so much, Ken, for that gracious invitation and just to be here. You called me a little bit like the godmother, the fairy god. So I want to be the fairy godmother. So I brought my magic wand, and you can be the fairy godfather. And we'll see if we can create some magic here. Hello, everybody. Again, calling in from Ireland, just south of Dublin. Some of you may know it. And we've had a beautiful day here. And I'm just delighted to be here. I've been part of the Taos community for some years, quite some years, sometimes stepping into meetings, and excited about these pulse practices. Have signed up for others myself. So what I hope to do today is to share with you about action research. I'll give a rich example of very alive work. And hope that at the very least, you might be inspired to take some elements of the practices to your own work. It is my belief that action research can be a wonderful complement to conventional research, and that it also, we say action research for everyone, that it can also just inform our lives. So if I may, I'll show a few pictures so you maybe have a sense of things. And yeah, we'll have a little bit of interactivity now and then. And let's see. So maybe just first off the bat, you see a map here. So the Action Research Foundation that informs me, that's why it's important for me to mention it, that informs me is action researchers around the world. Some from the global south, not as many as we would wish, some from the global south, many from the global north. And it's a mix of individual practitioners and universities / think tanks. So it's that kind of mix. It's relatively small, and we see it as an affiliate of the Journal of Action Research that I've been leading for many years. And so it keeps things fresh, and it also allows the work not just to be on paper, but for people to step into community. We have podcasts, we also have meetings. So for me, action research should be this kind of living thing, and we're trying to stretch kind of scholarly norms with that. But you know, the big picture is that action research is a human-centered form of inquiry that essentially tries to help transformations happen. So we might also use words like pragmatic constructionist, and that of course is my connection with Ken's marvelous work on the relational, the social constructionist nature of reality. And when we take that seriously, if we stretch it just a little bit, we can begin to work inside of relationships and also inside of ourselves, helping transformations happen. So that's kind of the big picture that I'd like to double click on as we go through. The larger, why at this particular time, why are we even talking about transformations? And I would use the word apocalypse. Apocalypse, I was trained as a theologian, so don't be too scared. But apocalypse is from the Greek word meaning to lift the veil. So I would say the veil has been lifted on how difficult it is for many, many people in the world right now. Even if you can't see the exact details, on one side of the slides, you see graphs climbing, and it speaks to mental ill health that is being reported around the globe, perhaps especially by young women and young people generally. So we have this kind of ill health as one example of social apocalypse. Then in terms of the environmental or eco apocalypse, of the 12 planetary boundaries that have been studied over the past while, nine of them are in precarious state. So by planetary boundaries like deforestation, climate change, biodiversity, these kinds of things. So that is, I'm not going to be talking too much about that, but that is the background of why I really invite people to learn more about action research and to use at least some of its tricks and techniques and insights in your own work. Before I go any further, because I'm saying to learn more, I would love to just get a little pulse in the chat if you would. Some of you have already shared where you are in the world, but I'd love to know what's the temperature outside your door. So if somebody's in Brazil, it's probably a lot hotter than my 10 degrees here in Ireland. But I'm also very curious, the years of familiarity with action research that you have. So if you'd please take a moment and just write it all in one line, the place you're in the world, hyphen the temperature outside, so we can kind of attune around the world, and then how many years of familiarity. And if it's 0, that will help me. And if it's 40, then I will be asking for your insights. So let's just take a moment to send that out on the chat. I'll stick mine in the chat as an example. Oh, 43 years. Oh my goodness me. Oh, so there's quite a bit of familiarity and some entirely newcomers. Hi, Rolla, 25 years. Yay. Welcome, Franklin. Do not worry, only having 0 years. We'll figure it out. We'll also be in little breakout rooms in a little bit. Action researchers love participation. We love interactivity. I always try to build that in. And so you may find yourself with newcomers versus more senior people. All right. Thank you, thank you. Depends on how action research is defined. Well, let us proceed. Let us proceed. I personally take a very big tent view of action research. Some of you might know different labels. Participative action research. It's a little bit more political, but that's very close. Action inquiry, obviously. Appreciative inquiry, I think that's fairly well known in the Taos community, is a form of action research. So in some ways, it's a way of working that brings action and research together. Sounds so simple, doesn't it? But there's a real alchemy there, and that we might talk about later. So big tent. I see in particular through the journal that this work is being taken up a lot in medical and international development circumstances. There's a lot of push to participation. And so in some ways that's, these are kind of newcomers to the field. And then there's people who've been doing a very rich, sophisticated type of action research. It's all good. It's all good. So fundamentally then, action research is a relational approach. So this human-centered piece helping transformations happen. So let me sketch just a little bit I would hope what is a useful conceptual model for this work. And then I'll give a rich example to try to bring that alive, and then invite you into trios to see what might be useful or what lands for you, what questions you might have, and then we'll complete with a couple more ideas and hopefully some inspirations among you. So for today, let me say that action research kind of works by bringing together individuals and institutional actors who have a stake in a particular field, in a field of inquiry, in an organization. So field as organization, a way that organizes activity. So people have a stake around a particular inquiry. And it's relational in the sense that we're creating a space. So people can be there without necessarily feeling much connection, contact. It's not very real, their set of relationships. So a very important work that I'll underscore, but it's very much there often just in the background, is the intention and the practices that create relationship, that bring people more and more into relationship with one another. Not necessarily that we're all lovey-dovey and love each other. I'll talk a little bit later about that, but there is an understanding that together we create this field. The work of learning, if I had to choose one word, I would call that the work that really happens inside this relational space is that we're reframing. We're reframing the rules of the game. If our field, the example that I bring, if our field is living in community together, then the rules of the game often have to do with who had power, 20 years ago when we first created this community together, like an eco-village is the example I'll bring. So who has power? We've just fallen into these habits together. How do we begin to be more conscious and choiceful about what's going on, especially where it's impeding where we want to go? So the work of reframing after relationship building, and then it should be A, B, C, and then experimental. Experimental, this is very important, kind of where the rubber meets the road. It's not just about reframing, and it's not just about relationship. It's actually about bringing these things into repatterning our set of circumstances. And today I'm motivated to say that what really is happening under the surface is we're repatterning our own identities with one another. And within that, then the field begins to change. And out of that, what Ken would call future forming or better futures can begin to happen. That may sound a little abstract. I hope to make it more real. A little picture maybe with the same information. So starting out of a sense of being in relationship with one another, and that relationship may be difficult, but I'm in relationship. Knowing that gives me a little bit of purchase on the situation. We're not just kind of entities, we're not just robots. It's a way of thinking about life from a more human-centric, relational approach. It's not the only way to think about reality. I just find it a very powerful one. Then we're coming into the work together of reframing. So there's some relationship building to allow for reframing together. This is the constructionist orientation here, right? That we're not just recipients of reality, we make reality with one another, to a certain degree. I don't make the rain, but I can, and my interpretations, especially with others, about what it means to live inside almost constant rain as we do in Ireland. How do we make sense of that? And that's just a simple example. An experiment. How do we work together, change how we work together such that we can bring about a better future? So hopefully that's enough of a little background to allow this example to land for you. So this work is ongoing. We're a year in. I was invited to work with an eco-village, let's just say in a European context. And this eco-village is 25 years old. So, that's been hanging in there for quite some time. Today it houses, or it hosts, the land hosts 100 families. And I was invited in because there was a sense of there's future forming that needs to happen here, and the community is struggling a little bit. And that future forming is things like, there's a lot of demand for housing. There's just like technical material problems, like the sewage system just doesn't work for what we have. The solar power doesn't hook into the power grid, so there's these material questions that people have. And I invited, researcher that I am, that we do a simple survey to ask the community, what's up? What's really at stake? This is a very important question, I think, for action researchers. What's really at stake here? And so we sent out that survey, and lo and behold, yes, amid the sewage problems and the housing problems and the power grid problems, all of it, under all of that, people expressed a great concern about what came to be termed social cohesion. Social cohesion is struggling. We're not where it was. We've been here, like there's a generational shift, and we're worried. That was kind of the message that came across in this kind of qualitative survey. And I was really glad that, that we had done that. So the next thing an action researcher really wants to encourage is all participation, yet structured, because some of you may disagree with this. I would say it's almost impossible to work with 100 times, whatever, 2, 3 people in a family. It's almost impossible to work with very large numbers like that. What needs to happen is a smaller steering team needs to be empowered so that there's a relationship of great importance between the small team and the larger community. So, as is often the case in the work that I do, not always. So I'm telling you how I do it. I think the general principles exist for almost all action researchers, but how I'm doing it, I'm just trying to bring it alive as a story. So I spoke, it was actually over Zoom in the beginning. I spoke to an all community meeting and shared the importance of participation, that everybody be involved, and that we needed a smaller group. And so inside that meeting, these are half-day type meetings, a small steering committee was empowered. We could come back to the whole issue of power is always tricky in an eco-village, in a family, in any kinship network, in any organization. Power is a tricky thing, right? But so we could say empowered enough to work. So we started to work together, so that would then be me and the steering team, but always, sometimes even in our physical meetings, we'd have some empty chairs to remind ourselves who we're working for. So that the field that I spoke about before, the field that we're working on behalf of, is this larger eco-village. So then the issue of data collection becomes important. So how do we really invite people to unpick what social cohesion means? It's not even a term that any of us even liked. Some of us wanted to talk about belongingness, togetherness, friendliness, you know, but social cohesion just became this generic term. But what does it mean for the community? And I think this is important. Again, I would say in action research, methodology is participative, and you want it to be a little bit prefigurative of where you're going. So if social cohesion is our inquiry, and we have system actors who care about that, then the data collection needs to serve social cohesion in some way. And so of the many, many, many practices and methods and techniques that exist, we ended up agreeing that we'd invite folks to a walk and talk. That way the land itself, so an eco-village, obviously people, well, maybe not obvious, but eco-villages are villages where the land often produces food, and it's just a thing of beauty and a thing of inspiration for the families, that the land itself would be a stakeholder, but obviously it's a voiceless stakeholder. So how do we give that voice? So people would walk and talk in random trios, in a way to promote a little bit more conversation, especially where people had stopped talking with each other, and they would do photo voice. So photo voice is a practice. It's kind of a critical organizing practice, but basically you take a picture, you bring it, you share it, and you talk about it. So walk and talk plus photo voice, so that each is, so already there's a bit more fluidity coming in. Am I hearing a voice saying something, or I should just continue? Alex, are we good to continue?
Yes, you are, yes.
Okay, great. So we've talked, we have a small team, we've begun to do data gathering. Important to continue emphasizing that it's okay if you didn't make it that Saturday, come next Sunday, you know what I mean? It's always a welcoming process because we're prefiguring social cohesion. We want people to feel welcome, especially those who have been feeling upset or discarded or hurt. Hurt will begin to figure quite highly. Now, inside the small team, I then brought in a self-assessment, invited people to look at, to become more reflexive, if you will, themselves. So inside of this is a little bit of a belief, if you will. I would hook it into nonlinear complexity theory if you want to talk about theory, but the idea that there's a fractal and that the fractals shifting can begin to shift. Or for those of you who drink kombucha or make sourdough bread, there's a SCOBY, there's a culturing process that's happening in the little culture that can begin to culture out. And also vice versa, right? There's this, we want the team very much to connect with the larger group. So where we are now is, so all of this has been done, information has been shared back into the larger community, and that community, I'm making it very brief here, is basically beginning to see there is a lot of love. Yes, there's hurt and there's a lot of love. See, if you don't see the pictures of love, you only are left with your own kind of negativity bias of, oh, so there was a sense of, oh, it's not actually that bad. So that was a good thing in the meetings. You know, we'll get through this. We'll continue. So there was a re-upping of commitment, continuing to aspire to social cohesion, but not just to aspire, but to actually work inside of work groups that would work on sewage and solar power, that would now work more consciously with social cohesion. So I'll give you just the example from the small fractal, from the SCOBY group. So the steering team of 5, Is that the one I want to go to? The steering the steering group of 5. So in asking them to do a self-assessment of 3 things, their own habits of power, their own habits of giving and receiving feedback, their own habits of collaboration, it was an invitation for them to become reflexive, for them to become aware of some of their own relational practices. Because when you double click, when you open up, what is relationship? What is relational space? It's obviously enabling when we feel togetherness, but it's also disabling. So how are my habits, your habits, his habits, her habits of using power, of perhaps never giving feedback or only giving negative feedback, right? There's no right way to do it, but just to acknowledge what are my own habits became an important form of assessment. The assessment, I'll just say briefly, was online or on your phone. So it's an online assessment where people are essentially projective hypothesis. They're essentially looking at cards and in certain circumstances, how do I react in this situation? Two of the most selected cards I think are interesting. One about what's my habit of feedback. On a bad day, many people agreed their habit around feedback is just like, oh God, please don't. Just, I don't want to hear any feedback. But there was an acknowledgement that this is a bad day. This is me on a bad day. I'm feeling down for whatever reason. Versus on a good day. So there's the multiple selves that we have, right? On a good day with the right, so-called right people. So my capacity is such that hearing different voices, I think, may open up possibilities through new ways of seeing and thinking. So these are just 2 of the many cards that people selected, but that we could talk about this. We could acknowledge we have bad days, we have good days, and we can stretch ourselves because people have capacity to hear different voices. So I'll end this telling of the tale with the words of one of the people on the steering team of 5. So remember, he's working in this steering team and also into the larger community. And he says, we learned, number 1, to challenge ourselves inside the small team, to be a catalyst, understanding we're not just coordinators, which is originally how they had framed it. We're not just coordinators. We are part of the story of evolving community. So you see there's a relational and a reframing happening here. Number 2, the tensions that we're going through as a group, because they're not buddies, right? They were kind of a random group coming in. The tensions we're going through as a group mirrored the very deeper tensions in the community. Again, why I would suggest it's a little bit of a fractal, a little bit of a SCOBY here, reculturing the process. And we needed to peel back the layers to discover what lies beneath each of us. So in other words, we had to get to know one another and our habits of feedback, power, and so on. And we each have an individual story, but these stories capture experience. And so the word that keeps cropping up was togetherness. So social cohesion had begun to be talked about as togetherness. And that was the key for moving forward. So as I had reported before, it wasn't like everything's been fixed and we're all just happy and loving one another. No, it was that much more togetherness became apparent to people under what they might not have seen. So the photo voice and the walk and talk was really very helpful for that. This is a non-linear process. There were arguments, there were hurt feelings, for sure, but overall, there was this sense of togetherness. I want us to go into trios after this slide, but just conceptually, I'd like to suggest that what you're hearing here is what we would call the 7 quality choice points of action research. We use these actually also in the journal. They're used at a couple of universities around the world where action research is part of their master's programs. And so what you're hearing is we're starting from number 1, intention. So it's holding an intention for the work. When I say what is at stake, that becomes a very important way to motivate, to get going. And that's different from conventional research, where you find your research question in the literature, or in the history. This is engaging with people in their immediate experience. What's important? What do we want to spend the next year or two of our lives in inquiry about? What's our intention here? And as I mentioned, that became to be understood as social cohesion. It wasn't just, fix the roof intention. Partnerships. You're not doing action research if you're not somehow in partnership. So here, the invitation to all people to empower a small group and the promise to go back to the large group. So somehow keeping us all in this work, especially because the intention is social cohesion, right? That's super important. Creating partnership. The questions get defined in partnership. I, as the lead action research on this, I would usually bring things. It's my style. It's not necessarily the right way, but I would bring things as a draft, and then we would change it. We keep what we want as a group, or change it. But that felt like an efficient process. Entirely structureless, is very difficult, I think, to work with. Number 3, contribution is something that, when we write this work up, we'll have to think more, but maybe it does have something to do with this fractal organizing or soft organizing, I sometimes call it. You hear in photo voice, walk and talk, these are PAR methods. These are participative action research methods. Participative, because if that's what we're trying to get to, if we're trying to get to social cohesion, we don't just want to describe it and do a survey, and we actually want to put people into and have them experience their own movement away from and towards social cohesion, and that allows much richer meaning making. In terms of sustaining the work, well, within the community itself, it is ongoing, but there's a hope that one day when we write this up, when we share this, or maybe make a little video, it might actually be useful to other eco-villages or other intentional communities. And so taking some thoughts about that before we finish. Number 6, developmental reflexivity, super duper important. So we're inviting people to reflect on, you remember I emphasized their habits of power, feedback, collaboration. That's a kind of reflexivity. We're not often aware of feedback. It kind of lives under the surface. I might have a reaction to it, but I don't necessarily have a practice of it. And so in the small team, there was strong encouragement to become conscious of, and to some degree even choiceful about. And so I would encourage more and began to see more conversations among people about, can I give you some feedback on that? Or I'd love some feedback on that. Or, power is a much trickier thing to talk about, but there was a little bit stepping into those conversations. Like, it's a little tiresome that the same folks have been running the community for years, and newer folks, younger people are finding it hard to get a look in. How do we address that? So that gently began to bubble up about 6 months into the process. And then number 7, re-narrating. So the words that I used, that I showed you on the slide before, these words here, that's an example of re-narrating. They're literally verbatim, written by the small team, so that they themselves experience themselves as re-narrating. So I am going to pause there and invite you to go into trio groups. And we'll or maybe Tara, Alex, if you would, I can talk people into them, and you might just set up random trios. Is that okay?
Yes, sure. I'll set them up.
Thank you. So when Alex gives us the go, I'm inviting us to leap in like a puffin, leap in to our random trio. Who knows? We might meet old friends, new friends, and to share just very briefly what is at stake in your work, in your life. And then how could some element of action research help? I leave that to you. You want, of course, to just very briefly introduce yourselves. It's just 12 minutes for 3 people. So, like 3 minutes each kind of thing. And then an additional 4 minutes to see if there's something connecting. So briefly introduce yourselves and your context. Share maybe one element if something has spoken to you, like, oh yeah, I like this idea of participative methods, or I like this idea of asking what's at stake, whatever. And just please enjoy. I believe we can say welcome back to everyone. And I'm seeing smiles. I'm always very, very happy to take that as feedback that something good happened. I want to invite us to a minute or perhaps two of silence and reflection. And I'll remind you the question that I sent you off with, and perhaps you've been inspired with something else. But we would love to see brief, as you know, as brief as one can, to hear what is at stake in your work life. You know, it could be we were just sharing, you know, I'm struggling with the political situation in the USA. I'm struggling around the war in the Ukraine, you know, whatever. And how could some element of action research help? You may have a question. You may want to put something else in the chat, but please just take a minute or two of silence and then share briefly in the chat so we have a little bit of a read of one another. And I'll call us back in about a couple of minutes. Thank you, everyone. It's really lovely to feel we're among the theme. I'm going to continue for a little bit more. There's a theme here: hierarchy, power, social cohesion. So I'll talk a little bit more about some of those issues. I think they're the more difficult ones. And so learning to tread lightly has been my life's not yet complete learning. Okay, so I have this little picture. So the idea, you know, the big picture idea that at this point in history, we're in this difficult place between feudalism. In some ways, feudalism continues. I won't say anything about Trump right now, but in some ways, feudalism continues, and many of us have grown up with it in our families. This kind of feudal hierarchy. Some of us have been blessed with something else. But there's also then this shift to power with, you know, since the 60s, I mean, before too, but since the 60s, this liberation movement that's been happening, especially in the West, and is now globalizing, right? So there's this like power over moving towards power with. And so it's a triangle becoming a circle. And I would suggest that, you know, this movement requires us and others to have more space within and with one another. That's kind of the basic thing. And that's why participative methods and process, if you think back to the story of the eco-village, it too had a power over, not so egregious, not totally feudalistic, well-meaning, but just by virtue of time, 25 years, a long time, any so-called non-structured society, organization begins to develop structure, precisely because we say, oh, there's no structure. A lot of that structure is actually rather difficult to name and own. So the reframing in the work that we did was a lot about gently pointing to power structures and the implications, you know, my habits of power, your habits of power, his habits of power. We were able to open it up gently and begin to talk. Now, there's a lot of goodwill inside an eco-village. There's a sense that, you know, that the social dynamics must also be refreshed, like the environmental and ecological parameters that we're trying to live in. So it's a little bit easier there. I think obviously there are spaces where it's more difficult, but moving towards power with. And, you know, again, it's the idea that this is really at the heart of the work, because it's within relational space that identities can begin to be stretched, get more space around them. So if I have been the one in charge, I don't have to give up being in charge. I just have to be much more choiceful about when and how I can be more empowering. So I think that's a strong message. It's not like, oh, grab people's power. It's not like that kind of a culture change. It's a peaceful one. Requires a lot of dialogue. It's not easy. And so in sharing the little bit that I shared about the assessment, I mean, there are other things too, but for me, this is a very important, kind of easy enough to do once people get a taste for reflexivity and just reflecting together, enjoying meetings together, to begin to look at their own habits. And essentially what we're therefore doing is becoming more aware of our own shadow. There's some therapists in the room, the idea that I can integrate more of what's been in shadow, and I can put myself out to support the growth of others. I like this from the poet Ben Okri, who says, we weigh ourselves down with tradition. It's not all bad, but we weigh ourselves down with tradition, with the past, with our past failures, our past forms, our past perceptions. We have made these things. We can unmake them. I think it's true that we have made them unconsciously often. And so future forming is often the unmaking, the unlearning, as we remake, as we reestablish a kind of a flexible identity with one another. And that we can have multiple identities. So I think at the heart of this work, the heart of this SCOBY, the heart of this culturing, is this redefining of self and system that happens over a period of time. I would say it's a developmental movement, like it's a kind of a stage-wise movement of a group, and that the emotion of anxiety, fear, that is consistently present. I mean, as animals, we're kind of anxious little beings, right? Prone to panic attack when it's really bad. But anxiety is there, and acknowledging that, accepting that, and being good and helpful about that, so that there's a greater sense of friendliness. And simple techniques. Action research is famous for its check-in. This comes directly from Kurt Lewin, that all voices are heard. We did it today in the chat, but there's an invitation to all voices to be heard first, because it kind of marks the group with there's more voices here to be heard. So we're a little bit moving towards friendliness and hoping for the epistemic emotion of curiosity. Curiosity is a great one. Now, anxiety doesn't go away, but if we can encourage friendliness and curiosity, we can begin to move from a self-protective stance, which sometimes I'm not even aware of in myself, right? I don't feel my anxiety too much. So I'm not noticing how self-protective I am, right? But if we can begin to move more towards pragmatic cooperation through reframing, I think that's a huge shift already in a human group. And from that, later stages of collaboration and co-creation, but just getting to a more cooperative stance. And one of my favorite quotes that came up, or things that one of the women mentioned in the small group, I think, bringing a vulnerability that was kind of new to her in the small group with these people she didn't know so well in the eco group. She said, I realize I've always been looking for what I disagree with when somebody speaks, somebody I don't know too well in the community. I'm looking for what I disagree with. And that may sound very simple, but I thought, wow, that is such a huge insight, because that way you're moving more towards enacting kind of friendliness, becoming more curious. It's like, oh, I don't just get stuck in disagreeing. There's something here that I might learn. So this developmental, it can seem very simple, but I think it grows a spaciousness also within ourselves. In fact, I love this idea so much that I bring the term developmental friendship and suggest it's kind of a mechanism of this self-organizing, fractalic, soft organizing that we're talking about here, this reframing, reorganizing. that we're engaged in shared work. See, we don't have to like each other, but we realize we have shared work to do, that we feel high regard. It's like, okay, I don't have to like you, but I'm going to invite myself and presume of you that we will meet with high regard. We're wishing to become better known to one another. So there's a little bit more sharing of truth. There's a commitment to self-development. See, otherwise there can't be any reflexivity. There can't be any giving and receiving of authentic feedback. So this is kind of a developmental friendship that's a little bit out of depth. We're experiencing this quest. In the eco-village, it's that the eco-village continues, that we get over this hurdle we're currently in after 25 years and can look to a long future, form a future together. And we recognize the significant role of the third, a mutual friend or community. In the eco-village, it's very obvious who that community is. It's the eco-village. In other circumstances, it might be less clear, but it's the idea that we can dissolve our upsets when there are difficulties. Dissolve it into something bigger, into kind of a bigger intention, like we're doing work here together. So maybe just to begin to finish out, the suggestion here is that subjectivity is invited, that intersubjectivity is the space that we do a lot of our work in. But objectivity, or third person, is also important. You know, we need facts and figures, we need surveys, we need to know where to put the sewer systems and so on. But I can have opinions about that, and I can share that in my walk and talk, in my participative methods. And so what we're trying to do is integrate these appropriately. The idea that objectivity is enhanced when there's clarity about my subjective biases. I'm absolutely positive this is not a new idea here. Any constructionist orientation requires this, you know, because there is no objective, there is some objective reality, but there's not only objective reality. A lot relies on how I interpret things and how we do that together. And therefore, this integration feels very important. And so there's different ways, you know, the subjectivity has a story. The second person interactivity is happening with one another, so relational practices. But there's also a way to tell and bring in information about the objective facts of the case. And so how we speak about, and am I saying I, am I saying he, they, you know, just becoming more clear about that, so that science and the much more partial truths of subjectivity can begin to kind of muddle along together through dialogue and collaboration. I mean, there's a lot in that, and how to unpack that. There's no paint by numbers way, but this idea that there's an integration as a kind of a golden requirement feels important. So let me end here, and then we'll have another pause and maybe put something in the chat, and we'll open up into dialogue. I believe we have covered the following key ideas, and I hope that at least one of them will have landed for you. That the approach is pragmatic constructionist. So it's knowledge creation that is changing experience of reality. And it's not just in language form. We as action researchers put a lot of emphasis on material reality. So it's kind of balancing those. We're working always through three spaces. They're not necessarily in balance, but we're trying to, you know, make sure we're not over-privileging one. So there's a relational space, there's the conceptual reframing space, and experimental space. If we have too much of one, you know, we just have like a talk shop. It's really fun relationship, but we don't actually do anything, or we don't learn anything. We're not really doing action research, or at least not high quality action research. However, in the beginning, we may truly emphasize relational work, you know? So you get the idea. It's like, what is the right balance? Again, there's no magic answer to that. I introduced the 7 quality choice points, starting with what is at stake. Feels very important. It's quite different from starting with what's your opinion about, right? It's what is at stake for us here, we who are system actors, who have a stake in this system. because it's our assemblage, our willing to work together, to reframe things, to experiment. That's what will make the difference. Relational space is the catalyst of transformation because identities are relational identities. Things about power, things about feedback, things about collaboration can really shift together. As I think is clear, we're turning the camera around on ourselves. This is the idea that subjectivity comes to be looked at, right? So we make it object. In the language of psychology, we make the subject object, so it can be reintegrated. So reflexivity is really a leap beyond norms. It's not something that everybody wants to do, so we have to kind of go lightly, but it feels very, very important for the kind of transformation work that we're trying to do here. Power cannot be ignored. How to make it discussable, how to make it less anxiety provoking is a little bit like figuring out the magic sauce of our work. And again, you know, the collaborative, participative way of doing that. And my hope is that developmental friendship offers a protainer, like we have to contain ourselves in our work. I say protein because we're doing it for, you know, we're forming the future together. It's a protainer that contains our anxiety enough for friendliness and for curiosity to arise, because I think that's the magic sauce for the transformations that are happening. So I would love to again pause, and we're coming up on 75 minutes, and we said 75 to 90 minutes. Those of you who want to check out now, thank you for being here. And those of you who would like to stay till the bottom of the hour, please do. And maybe write in the chat what's coming up for you. Maybe there's a question, maybe there's an inspiration. And then when we see everything on the chat, we can read each other, have a read of who's here in the gallery. Then we'll see how we stumble towards dialogue for the next 20 minutes together. I can see that Catherine's question also gets a heart. When it gets a heart, so maybe we'll start there. And then I invite folks who wish to speak or double click on particular things to use the tools down the end. How do we do that? I think we go into participant list. Alex, do you know how do we raise a hand here?
So at the bottom of the screen, there are the reactions. And
is it, oh, it's under heart. So there's a picture of a heart. So if you want to raise your hand, or for all I care, raise a balloon. Oh, there you go. That's really cute. Please do, and then we'll know to invite you to speak. Yeah, I see appreciative inquiry, by the way, as a form of action research. Action research is a helping transformations happen. Somebody asked, is that it? Yeah, that's kind of it. Not very easy to do. Soul food, yes. Okay, so Catherine's question. I came across many hurdles in my university to action research, in particular red tape and ethics approval. Have you any comments? So let me start this up, and maybe if Catherine wants to speak to it or others. So yeah, I mean, having been a professor myself for many years, I strongly encourage those who do action research to complete what in the States is called the Human Subjects Review, what in other places can be just called the Ethics Board. Generally speaking, you may have to educate the Human Subjects Review staff so they get what participative knowledge is. I think you can't just say, oh, we're going to participate and we're going to figure it out. You go through as much conventional language as you can. Here's the question. This is what I'm expecting. And then the super duper, I think really at the heart of human subjects and ethics approval is really this issue of confidentiality, how you're going to take care of people's confidentiality and facilitate them leaving if they would wish to leave. At least in my experience, that's been the most important. And I was last at the University of Oregon's Academic Medical Center. So there's a lot of time, money, and effort put into human subjects review, and always got my stuff reviewed as positive. I was able to do it. So I feel like I'm speaking from a sense of it's absolutely possible to do it. I did have to educate a little bit, but once I did and so on, there was a sense that, oh, this work almost inherently is ethical because it's participative. If people are joining always voluntarily and so on and so on, that was all good. So that's my very simple answer to what I know is a question that many people have. So Catherine, if you're still here, if you want to maybe speak a little bit more to that, and there may be others.
Hi, Hilary. Thank you so much for your presentation. Yes, I'm in Ireland, in what was an Institute of Technology and has become a university.
Mhm.
And 10, 15 years ago, I was able to do action research with my students in when the process for getting approval was very informal.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of trust, and it went really well. And I did some work that I consider to be really wonderful and that the students would have told me was wonderful. But we have now got a whole different setup culturally, with all kinds of boards and forms, and a refusal to give clear guidelines in the first place. So it's all guesswork to try and jump through hoops, and they keep changing them. So I've pulled back, and what has really been good is I've done some significant first person research.
Mhm.
But I'm in a place now where I really feel like I'd like to be able to go back.
Mhm.
So it's just how to work with, it's not as simple as informing people. There's a lot of power play, and there's a lot of jostling for power, and
Mm.
it's
It
like
sounds like it's not, well, and because Ireland is so small, I can say, Catherine, we can have coffee somewhere in the middle. But it sounds like you have a unique circumstance, that you're moving, more towards bureaucratizing your processes. All I want to say is hang in there. Action researchers do get human subjects review approval, and once you may end up having to help them figure out what it is they're most concerned about. But yeah, but to hang in there and not to avoid these processes, because it allows you, or at least in the States where it's quite rigorous, it allows you then publish off the material, because otherwise you're gathering data, you're doing all this work, and you can't really use it. So I would strongly recommend that you use your time and creativity well. But yeah, you may have to teach them. What a scary thought.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And yeah, please do reach out. I'm just up the road. Are you down in Waterford?
I am, yes.
Yeah, yeah. Aor at doctoral, I'm just jumping down. Aor at doctoral student. Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to look at the actionresearchplus.com website, there's tons of resources there. The handbook, the journals. So in other words, there's quite a lot of published material. The website gives more informal, which can give us a little bit more hope, because sometimes when you see, all nicely done work, you think, oh my God, this was so perfect, but it's never perfect. So yeah, doctoral students are strongly encouraged to do this. S. George. No hearts and balloons, but please.
Sometimes raising a hand as an action research works better than complex technology. My full name is Shanti George. It's not here, unfortunately. I found your presentation very refreshing after a long career in conventional academics, where action research is treated as an oxymoron, a term with two halves which don't really go together, because research is often felt to be about reflection, removed from action. And action is felt to be something that happens outside the ivory tower by activists, by practitioners, whereas research is something that happens in the ivory tower. So the world that you opened up was extremely encouraging, inviting, and people in the room, of course, go along with it. But how do we take this message to the bastions of conventional academics, conventional practice, conventional activism, which see indeed that action and research are opposed to each other, cannot be integrated? Thank you.
Thank you, Shanti. You're asking the million-dollar question, or maybe it's the billion-dollar question. So I would first of all say that many of us exist. You saw in the chat perhaps that people have been doing this work for 30 years, for 20 years, for 10 years. Doctoral students are doing this work. So over my career, I have seen it grow. So that's the first thing to say, have hope. The second thing is, our universities are dominated by positivist thinking. It's a long conversation. It's not easy. So I think rather than, browbeating one another, I think using whatever degrees of freedom you have to do action research, perhaps in your own classroom, to encourage your students, however you can do it, to create your own island of coherence. I think it's Prigogine's idea, right? That there's these nonlinear, but if we're not doing what our heart asks us to do, we will become quite depressed. So doing that work, I must remember, early in my career, I remember I did an action research dissertation, and with all humility, I will tell you, it won an award at the Academy of Management, which was important because it suggests that doing action research can be very good work. You can do good work. I have published in A-level journals, all of that, blah, blah. So I have no doubt that the work can be done. I do know, Shanti, that there's a lot of obstacles to that work, but it's often internally as well. We have so imbued the dominant voice. So let me just see if there's something else to say. Oh yeah, don't be alone. If you can possibly find other colleagues. You see, in some ways, helping transformations happen inside a university to move some part, not all, we don't want all of it, but some part. I say 50% more social scientists ought to be doing action research, and therefore all graduate students in the social sciences and human sciences ought to learn about action research so they have it as an option. So if you're not alone, maybe it's just one or two people, colleagues, to have your own experiment with how do we do this work. There's resources around you. The Action Research Foundation exists as a resource so that people aren't feeling alone. And, there's university people inside of that, and universities themselves will have a think tank maybe that sponsors the work. So let me stop there and hope that I'm at least suggesting that it's not hopeless. In fact, there's much more momentum. If anything, we have another problem now. We have this insisting on participation in the international development world, in the medical world, because it gets better outcomes. That's the reason. But there's an insistence, and that can also have problems. But to me, that's a good thing. Have I touched a little bit what your concerns are?
You've been very helpful. Thank you.
I'm so glad you're here. Thank you. Let me check if there, because I want to talk to this issue of, yeah, I'm not seeing any other balloons or hands. This issue of action and research are incompatible, an oxymoron. You use the word
Can I just add to that just briefly?
Yes, please,
Hilary?
please do. Yeah.
One thing that's happened, at least here in the United States and in the UK, is this huge opening now to qualitative research in general, which means non-positivist research, basically. So, and there's a lot of legitimation of that, of why positivist research is limited and why we should open up to these alternative orientations. So there is a sort of fresh wind that's now blowing through the social sciences. The other thing, and I'll just mention it briefly because it's to recognize the possibility that what we're talking about is a different kind of knowledge, and that what positivism generally looks at as knowledge is that which can be produced in a proposition, and that what we're doing here in terms of knowledge is generated within the process of knowing, within the process of relating. And that kind of knowledge is in itself enormously important and central, but it just gets pushed aside in terms of this emphasis on propositional knowledge. So I think, in fact, that the movement really should be more in the direction of this kind of process knowing that is the key to our living together with each other.
I'm noticing the time, and I believe Lok wants to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Hilary. Well, time is always too short, I think. I'm really impressed when I listen to your experiences and your insights and your knowledge about action research. Ken, you started with opening, telling that action research may be so crucial and so important in this rapidly changing times. And I think when I listen to Hilary, then many opportunities are given in doing action research in many ways, I think. So what I like is that you express that action research can be seen as a relational approach, helping transformations happen. And then at the end, you were talking about this connectedness, this importantness of being connected with each other. And I think there's a possibility, there's hope. You were talking about hope. We can reconnect. We really can reconnect. And one of the participants, Luc Verheijen from Belgium, was writing in one of the chats, this fractal thinking in many ways, it can be very little or it can be a little bit more bigger. We can do what we can, he was telling in the chat, he was writing, with what we have, where we are. And I would like to add also to this, with what we can create or can co-create together. And then you were talking about we have made those things. We are making this reality, so we also can unmake it or making another or an alternative or a more hopeful reality. And I think that's very hopeful, I think. So thank you very much, Hilary, for your session. That's really what we want to show in our webinars, in the Pulsating Practices, to show how relational practices and how we can use social constructionist thoughts in co-creating these hopeful futures. So thank you very much for this, well, in the Netherlands, this evening. Thank you, Hilary.
My great pleasure. It's an honor to be here. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
And also thank for the participants to joining this webinar. The next webinar, the next Pulsating Practice, I'm very happily and proud to announce myself. Alex asked me to announce it. So the next Pulsating practice it will be in April, the beginning of April, will be about education. So how does it look like when we use social constructionist ideas in the educational field? And then when I was listening today to you, Hilary, I recognized so many things in approaching social construction in this educational field. So be happy, be invited for the next session. And then I will give the word to Alex, who will tell you some practical things. Thank you for this being here today. Alex?
Yes, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Hilary, for a wonderful, inspiring presentation. And just a few quick things. So I put the link in the chat to Luke's event, the next webinar that is coming up next month. I'm also sharing the link to the Taos Institute Commons, the online community where you can continue to engage with each other. So post questions, comments on this webinar, on this event, and access many other free resources. And we also have two exciting courses coming up, an Introduction to Social Construction online course that will be happening in May, and a very new self-paced course, the very first self-paced course by the Taos Institute, and that is coming up. We don't have an exact date yet, but in the next few weeks, so keep an eye out for our newsletter and our announcements, and we hope that we will continue to spread these ideas. So thank you so much for coming, and have a great day, evening, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Bye, Ken. Bye, Luke. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.